Hey there, everybody. How are you today? I want to welcome you here on this morning to Prog Monster. My name is Murph. I am the host of this show, a show dedicated to progressive rock and other forms of rock music. So, we're doing a live stream today. I don't do these too often. My technical skills at live streaming are, I would say, they're better than they were, and they're getting better all the time. So, it's a learning curve, right? So, I'm learning how to use all these different tools. And so I feel comfortable enough now that I know enough that I can do the live stream. Haven't gotten into quite yet having guests on the show or anything like that. That may be something that will come along hopefully within the next year or so. That's my target date, was for the summer of this year coming originally. And it will probably be ahead of that. But at this point in time, this is where we are. So I'm going to be doing these shows fairly regularly now. I did one last month, the Rush one, and now we're going to do Pink Floyd. Yes, this band here, Pink Floyd. Yeah. So I've actually done Into the Progverse, which is what this show is called, on Pink Floyd before, but it was just as a video for my video collection. This time I'm going to do a live one with them. This is a band, for those of you who are been in the clouds or somewhere and haven't noticed, there's been this band Pink Floyd for decades now. They just recently, actually, I heard, sold their entire discography collection to Sony for a whopping $400 million. People would say, why would they do that? Why would they give up their rights to that and stuff like that? Well, at this stage of the game, I don't think they're going to be making any more albums. And, $400 million would go a long way to securing your family's future, right? Especially in these troubled times. And, a lot of artists have gone this way now, too. I think I've heard the Eagles are going this way or have gone this way. So, these are two of the bands that was difficult to get to play their music online. They were very strict about that. So, and possibly for this reason, that they wanted to control their discography for a major sale when it became evident. And Sony seems to be the place that goes for that, because they own all the Michael Jackson and the Beatles stuff as well. I just hope I don't see Pink Floyd ads on like tampon commercials or stuff like that, but hard to say what they'll use it for. Anyways, I'm going to start the chat a bit. So basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about Pink Floyd for this next hour, and however long it goes beyond that, but it'll at least be probably about an hour anyways. I hope that people will join in, and if they got any comments or any questions, I'll try to answer them, or perhaps you might have an answer for me on a particular question. That's what I'm hoping for too, because this is all about learning about bands, right? So I'm going to do this in a kind of a similar way I did Rush. We're going to talk about the albums, and as it's prompt, we will talk about different bits about the band. Now, I do know quite a bit about Rush, not so much about Pink Floyd. It's funny with these legacy bands. There's so many things that go on for such a lengthy time. You have to be almost a connoisseur of the band to understand all of the implications of everything they've done. And Pink Floyd has had a lengthy career, kind of culminated with The Wall, although they did have several albums that came out after that. They really haven't been functionally involved out there in a big way for probably 3 or 4 decades now. Yeah, this seems impossible to say that, but that's the truth. So a band that was dominating for probably 20, 25 years, and then really hasn't done much since then. Maybe Roger Waters was right, which I highly doubt, but could be right that he wanted to end the band, and maybe it would have been better if they had ended it. Although I do enjoy some of the work that came out after he left the band too. Anyways, we'll talk a little bit about these in sequence of the albums in chronology. The first album, of course, is Pink Floyd's Piper at the... Sorry, I want to get this so there's no blur here. There it is, right there. Piper at the Gates of Dawn. So this album was their debut album. Now, at this point in time, when this album came out, they had been around playing around and doing little concerts and joining venues and doing all the stuff that a lot of bands were doing in the 60s. They kind of started around 1965 as a band, which featured the four members, Nick Mason, Richard Wright, Roger Waters, and Syd Barrett. That was the original lineup of the band. That's the lineup of the band on this particular album. But it's a very different sound from what people would come to think of Pink Floyd's sound as. They hadn't discovered their sound yet at that point. So this is a kind of a poppy album in a lot of ways, a lot of poppy stuff on here. It's got a bit of a psychedelic flair to it, obviously. If you look at the cover, very psychedelic, and not too dissimilar from a lot of bands that were coming about at that time period, except for these guys maybe had a little bit better of a sound than some of those bands. This is a good album. I wouldn't say it's a great album. It's very different. Vocals, of course, will be one of the first things you noticed about the band. They're very 60-ish style vocals. Syd Barrett's voice is very different than the rest of the members of the band. And the subject matter is more mainstreamish, I guess, but very psychedelic at the same time. I don't consider this to be one of their better albums, but it's not a bad debut album. I think it's a pretty solid one, but not necessarily a great album, you know. And for me, it was kind of a revelation when I discovered this album. Well, I'd heard of it for years, of course, but when I started collecting all of their stuff, when I started this channel, I was quite surprised at how different it was from what I would call Pink Floyd. But it's the Syd Barrett era, which is a lot more psychedelic and a lot more kind of poppy at times as well. So, yeah. And he was, of course, already well into his mental illness at this point. They were having difficulties with him when they would tour, that he'd get up there and there's nothing happening. And then, you know, or show up late or all kinds of different things. But, you know, great lyricist, though. Some of their better stuff came out then as well for that. Then they moved on to this album, which came out about a year later, I believe. It doesn't say so on my album here, but I'm sure it was about a year later. So that one was in 67. This one, I can barely make it out. I think this one was like 68. We could take out the booklet here and check it out here. This is a very psychedelic album, even more so than the initial album. It's actually quite a bit of a different album from that altogether. Yeah, there's still a little bit of that poppy element, and I do believe Syd does do one track on here. They did add one track. Yeah, this is from 68. But this album is very psychedelic, starting with the cover. Lots of bizarre stuff going on here, very kind of spacey, but not overly spacey. I think it's more psychedelic than spacey. Just the whole album has all kinds of psychedelic appeal to it, and the tracks are reflecting of that. They're kind of a little bit on the strange side. This wasn't a band that I would call mainstream at all. You know, all these tracks are kind of very different. And everybody at this point was doing some contribution to it. This is also the debut album for David Gilmour, who didn't really do much on this other than help co-write A Saucer Full of Secrets, which was the title track. He didn't do much in the way of writing, that is. He actually was the main vocalist, I believe, here. And then you have one tune right at the end that they added for Jugglin' Blues, which is Syd Barrett on vocals and had actually written the song. My favorite on this is probably Corporal Clegg and A Saucer Full of Secrets. And of course, the Set the Controls for the Heart of the Sun. All three of these are excellent songs. Very different, of course, from what you might, I guess, Set the Controls from this for the Heart of the Sun is kind of the beginning of that really Pink Floyd spacey kind of dark flavor to the music. But starting here on this their second studio album, which is called Saucer Full of Secrets. I do like this album. I initially liked it a lot, and then it didn't. After putting it in my playlist, I noticed it wasn't keeping pace with what I thought it would, but still not a bad album. And at this point in time, they were having all kinds of problems with Syd Barrett, and that's why they brought in David Gilmour to kind of shore them up when Syd wasn't going to show or do whatever he had to do. After a while, I think they didn't even bother getting him anymore. They just took David Gilmour, and the band kind of went on from there, removing him from the band, which I think was a hard thing for some of the members because they liked him, but he had that mental illness and just wasn't going to be able to continue with the band. Yep, excellent album for a second album, sorry. But you can already see they're experimenting. They've moved away from the pop sound quite a bit on that album, and then it's kind of gone a lot more psychedelic, but still within the more closely related to the first album than the next album. So the next album was a musical soundtrack, which came out in, I believe, 69 or late 68. I'm going to see if I can see that on this album first before we start talking about it. Where can it be? They don't really put no, this was the digital remastering. Does not say what year it was, but I'm pretty sure it was either the end of 68 or the beginning of 69. Not quite 100% sure of that. But it's a musical score, so they made this movie here, which is the film More. You can see the picture here on the back of the album. This is the front of the album. A little bit psychedelic, of course, but different. And they were asked to record the music for this album, which they did. Now, some people don't like this album. They say it's bits and pieces and choppy, and it does have parts of that in it. I definitely hear that when I listen to it. However, I do like this album quite a bit. It's got more of that Pink Floyd-ish sound to it. By this time, that was starting to move in that direction. And at this point in time, I also think, I'm going to take the book back out again. Got some pictures in here of the movie. Yeah, you've got a nice picture in here of the band. Anyways, yeah, so most of this stuff is now starting to be written by Roger Waters. He's now kind of taken over the lyrical parts, pretty much dominates the lyrical parts on this album. But you do have some stuff here, some instrumental album songs on it that the other members of the band contributed to as well. But you can clearly see that it's taken a huge change in different direction. And they were asked to put this score out. This is the first of 2 musical score albums that they did. And I think I like both of them. This one, maybe not quite as much. It's a little bit more shallow than a lot of their music was to come. Not as many noises and stuff. And that was my big thing when I was growing up. One of the reasons I didn't follow Pink Floyd initially, other than the fact that I didn't like The Wall when it first came out. I thought it was a weird album and wasn't, to me, a little bit on the poppy side, but didn't really interest me too much. The other thing was that I always said to people, I said, I think this band is just more about noises and sounds than they are about rock music. I didn't really see them as a rock band. That's just That's the mind. This album came out when I was only, I think I was just 16 when this came out. So I was still kind of closed to a lot of things that didn't, if it didn't meet exactly what I liked, I would have some reason to complain about it. So More, their third album from the either late 68 or 69, I cannot fully remember. The next album up is again some psychedelic flavor to it. This is actually a double album, their first, I believe, first double album by Pink Floyd. I don't know if any of you have seen this. If maybe you're a Pink Floyd fan, maybe you're not, and you don't know this album. This is Ummagumma. This album, I believe, came out in 69. Let's just check it out first before we get too far into it. It definitely is a double album. That is a certainty. So you have this released, again, they don't tell you. 69. So it was recorded in, well, parts of it was recorded in 1969. So you've got basically two albums here. So you have the studio album, which is the second album, has Syphilis, Grantchester Meadows, several species of small furry animals gathered together to live in a cave, and Groovy with the Picked, Narrow, that's the weirdest title ever, eh? The Narrow Way, The Grand Visor's Garden Party. Those are all songs on the second album, so it's kind of a studio album. Then you also have a live album on the first side, or in the first disc, if you prefer. Astronomy Domain, Careful with the Axe, Eugene, Set the Controls for the Heart of the Sun, which of course is on the second album, Saucer Full of Secrets, and then Saucer Full of Secrets as well. So this is to me, this is just I'm going to use a term that you won't hear me use too much. This is a hot mess. I do not care for this album. To me, that's the thing. So now that we've gotten to this album, you can see clearly there's a little bit of a cyclic flair to it. Each of these pictures is a repicture of the original picture, with everybody moved around and in different positions, and it goes back almost infinitesimally, as far back as you can see before it disappears. So actually I'm going to, and then you got this back part here on the album, which has all of the drums in front of this kind of weird setup here. Yeah, so this is a very strange, to me, this is one of their strangest albums. I don't really care for it. So then that's that, back to the point I was trying to make. So with Pink Floyd, they're one of the most polarized bands, I guess, in terms of great albums versus not so great albums. Some bands have their stinkers, so albums that aren't that great, but they have maybe as many stinkers as they have great albums, and they don't have many in the middle. There are a few in the middle. Saucer Full of Secrets, some of the other stuff are not bad albums, but then they have some really bad ones, and this to me is one of the first ones. I do not, other than the cover of this album and the premise of it, the double album with the live part I don't mind, but the rest of the studio album is just weird. I just don't care for it. It's a lot of racket, if you ask me. Maybe it'll grow on me once I've listened to it some more. I haven't listened to it that much because I didn't like it initially, and it's not an album it's not likely ever to go in my playlist unless it does something dramatic. But and I've read a lot online about it, and a lot of other people feel kind of the same about it. It's just kind of a weird album. So this is their fourth studio album too. So now we're going to talk about an album that really, I think the thing with this album we're going to talk about now is called, first of all, I'll tell you what it is. It's Atom Heart Mother. This is their fifth studio album, released in 1970. Now the band is starting to coalesce into something different. So this album is a lot more pastoral. In fact, I'll tell you, when I first heard this album, I thought, is this even a rock album at all? Like, it just sounds like a bunch of pastoral music, right? But after a while, after a while, I know it grew on me quite a bit. But up until this point with Pink Floyd, before I actually got into this album, at this point, I had listened to Dark Side of the Moon and Animals, which we'll talk about later, and of course, The Wall and Wish You Were Here. So those were the albums I kind of knew by Pink Floyd, all great albums. Maybe not so much The Wall, but the other ones, absolutely killer albums, and which had cemented Pink Floyd by the time I got to this album and to this channel, I had already cemented them as a strong level 2 band for me, usually in the top 10 or 12 of my favorite bands. And this album just pushed them over. I eventually made them into one of my group. So they became a group of 8 when this band joined. But it took them 40 years to get there. But this album, I listened to it a fair bit, actually. It's one of those Pink Floyd albums I go to fairly regularly. I like it as a background album. I don't sit there and listen to it straight. I like it as a background album. It soothes me. It's one of those albums I like to listen to when I'm reading, or when I'm just lying in the dark. I'll just listen to all the different noises on it. I know the band themselves don't really care too much for this album. They say it was kind of, I'll use the word shit album. I'm not really sure what the point is of all these cows, but that's Pink Floyd for you. So lots of that noisy stuff on it that you get from Pink Floyd albums, little sounds and people talking and all kinds of stuff. But it really is the beginning of that classic era of Pink Floyd for me. There are people who can't stand this album. For me, this is of the ones we've done up till now, this is the first really good one. Now, is it a masterpiece like some of the ones that come along later? I don't think so, but it's a solid album for me. I like that pastoral sound. I like the quirkiness of it. I even like the kind of silly cover here. So from 1970, Adam Hart Mother, their 5th studio album, probably the beginnings of the classic era of Pink Floyd starting here. Excellent, strong album, I think. So from this point on, for the next half dozen albums or so, they become the monster band that people know them as, selling millions and millions of albums and becoming among people's favorite bands. And I think it kind of starts with this one, Metal. So Metal is their 6th studio album. I remember reading something about what this was, this picture. You could see, here's the back too. Something to do with a toilet and a plunger, but I'm not 100% sure. To me, I think it kind of looks like some underground water animal floating in the ocean, but it's a really weird cover, but very psychedelic in a lot of ways. They still are retaining some of that psychedelic flavor to their music, and that would probably continue throughout most of their career with a little bit of that flavor, becoming more spacey as they go along, which is the reason I started following this, their spaciness. So the first and last track on this album, One of These Days and Echoes, are probably easily the 2 best tracks on the album, Echoes being the longest track. And then the songs in the middle, well, not terrible, but kind of highly unforgettable. I don't know much about them. I've listened to them before, but I just can't get it. This was take out the book here. So you can see, a lot of this kind of weird stuff going on, even in their pictures, in the picture of all 4 of them at this point in time. This album, again, doesn't say when it was released, but I believe it was in 71. Yeah, here it is. Released in 1971. Most of the stuff here, again, Waters and Gilmour now getting into the writing together on a few tracks. but still dominated primarily by Roger Waters doing the writing, but a lot more input by the other members of the band on this one. The final track here, Echoes, which is considered one of Pink Floyd's great songs, has all four of the members writing on it. I do like this particular track, and but I like the opening track much better. The pillow, oh, no, it's not One of These Days, which is an instrumental. So I like both of those tracks, but the other four tracks, not so much. I would put this in the classification of albums that are mediocre. Now, they don't have many of them, but I know a lot of people really like this album a lot, and I can see the appeal of it. I really can. But it just doesn't do anything for me other than the song Echoes and One of These Days. So the first two are really good, and the rest kind of not so good. But I think the cover is kind of a different cover too. I do like that about it. Yeah, this may end up being one of the albums I do. Nah, actually probably won't, but it's a bit of a disappointment for me. I really had heard so much about it, and then when I finally listened to it, I was just not. I was what they would call underwhelmed. This came out in November of '71, by the way. So I was kind of underwhelmed by it. So at this point now, Pink Floyd this is their sixth studio album. At this point, they've had 6 studio albums for which we have, for me, I had one good one, I had one very good one good one, and then a couple of mediocres, and then a couple I didn't really care much for. Now we get to what to me is the beginning of the really strong period for them. This is Obscured by Clouds. Now, some people do not like this album. It's kind of weird. It's got, of course, a bizarre cover as well. So it's supposed to be, it's out of focus is really what it is, but they're trying to give it that Obscured by Clouds. And this is them on horseback with a bunch of natives here on this interesting cover. So this is a movie score, same as More. The movie, I'm not sure what the name of it was. They had a problem with the producer of the album, the movie, so they did not title it after the movie. Oh, it's from La Valley. That's the name of the movie. They didn't call it La Valley. They decided to call it Obscured by Clouds for some reason. Again, released in '72, I believe. It doesn't say. Oh yeah, June of '72, this album. So by this time now they've had 7. This is their 7th studio album. A music score, of course. All the same members. Everything is going well. This is a original Hypnosis cover. Capture it. Lots of little pictures on the back of it as well. I like it. To me, it's a solid album. I don't know. I don't think I like it as much as Atom Heart Mother, but I do like some of the stuff on here. Again, it's got some parts in it that are kind of not complete. I think there's a lot of that feeling of on some of the songs of not being completed. And, so it's choppy like you would expect from a music score. So it kind of sounds like a music score, but it does have some stuff on here that is really quite good. Yeah, excellent album, I think. I don't think I like it as much as Atom Heart Mother. At this point, it's probably my second favorite of the first 7 albums, behind only Atom Heart Mother. But this is kind of the turning point for them. So they've had a couple of albums in a row where they've started to make that kind of headway to legacy band. The 3 predecessors, Obscured by Clouds, Atom Heart Mother, and Metal, all doing much better, I think, than the original albums, but still not really. And that Metal maybe did better than the other 2 and is more memorable and more known by a lot of Pink Floyd people. But then they just took right off after that and got into this album. Of course, I don't really need to say much about this album because so much has already been said about it. One of the great progressive rock albums, or just plain rock albums of all time. Cover, coincidentally, it's good, And this is not the original one, of course. The original one is much better than this, I think, but still good. But not a great cover, but the music on here is absolutely perfection. The way they weave noises and sounds and the album together, it's to me, it's a concept album. I'm not sure what the concept is. I'm sure somebody will explain that to me because I'm a little brain damaged, which coincidentally is one of the titles. Yeah, just so much happening here. Very spacey, some psychedelic flavor to it. Some really rocking stuff here. They actually had the single Money here, which did very well for them. This album sold more than 40 million copies. I consider it to be one of the 2 or 3 best progressive rock albums of all time, and one of the greatest rock albums of all time. But there's a lot of stuff going on here. A lot. You could spend a whole podcast or a whole stream just talking about this album. So a lot of the stuff, of course, written by Roger Waters, but there's a fair bit of involvement from the other members of the band as well. But he's the main writer here. Yeah, just a lot of stuff going on. I think there's a pyramid there, Egypt. Yeah, lots of interesting stuff going on here. This is a cult following album too. Like, there's people that worship this album. And it's just an exercise in perfection in a lot of ways. More shots here. There's Psychedelic Van, Pink Floyd Van. And this has like some really interesting soundscapes on it too. Lots of noises, but the use of noises like clocks and keyboard, and of course the keyboard and the synthesizer parts are pretty dominant on this as well. And I think maybe the best guitar parts from Pink Floyd are all on this as well. So there's a lot of near perfection here. The album flows in almost a precision, like it's absolutely perfect. There's no spot that was wasted on this album. Everything ties to the next thing that's going to happen. That's why I think it's, over the years, I liked it initially, and over the years, it's only gotten to a point. To me, it's a masterpiece album, and I think just about everybody feels that way about it. People who like Pink Floyd will consider this to be one of their best, if not their best album. It's definitely in my top 2 for sure. Anyways, so there we are. Well, this is Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon. I don't know if I said that. Released in 1973. Probably their epic. Probably reached the top of the hill with this album, and they were building towards it, and then they just coalesced into such a magnificent album. So we're going to go on there to the next album. Now, this next album continues along that perfectional trend. Not as many tracks, more track oriented. This one came out in 75, I believe. So they took a year or so off to produce this album. It's kind of the beginning of the disgruntled period of the band, where they're still making great albums, but not getting along as well as they were before. And that's understandable. By this time in 75, they've been together for 10 years. It's a long time to be with the same people. Yeah, released in July of 75. Recorded at Abbey Road Studios as well. Cover's a little different. The Guy on Fire, a little bit creepy. This feels very industrial, the album cover. The songs on it are all classic. This is the first kind of album where every song is a classic on the radio all the time. Shine On You Crazy Diamonds, Part 1 and 2, that bookended. You have Welcome to the Machine, which I think is one of Pink Floyd's absolute masterpieces. Have a Cigar, another great tune, and Wish You Were Here, the title track, one of the most well-known songs by Pink Floyd. Yeah, this is an absolute killer album. Some people would say they continued an upward trend when they did this album. Yeah, I can see that. For many people, this is the best Pink Floyd album. I understand it's not my favorite, but I understand that it's near perfection in many ways. Continuing along with the kind of feeling that you got on Dark Side of the Moon, and just really cementing this band. By the time this album came out, they were cemented as one of the great rock bands in history. And then we get on to this album next up from 1977. This is Pink Floyd's Animals. Really love the cover of this album. It's kind of dark and foreboding, the Orwellian world that this portrays, talking about the book Animal Farm. No, Animal Farm. Oh, we got somebody watching. Howdy. Yeah, so you've got like only 5 tracks on it, but they're all on the same theme. You've got Pigs on the Wing 1, and then Dogs, Pigs, 3 different ones, Sheep, and then you have Pigs on the Wing 2. This album is, to me, their best album. I think the reason I like this one the most, I've tried to analyze why I think this is a better album, or why I like it more than Dark Side of the Moon and Wish You Were Here. And I think the material on those 2 albums and is probably overall better, but this album is heavier. It's a heavier album. This may be Pink Floyd at their heaviest. This is almost like a metal album in some ways. There's almost that feel to it, like it's a metal album. There's no weak moments on this again. So they've now had, to me, they had 3 perfect albums in a row, spaced out over a 4-year period. This is their 10th studio album. I love this picture. I love this feel of this whole album. It's a dark album, but not. I wouldn't call this a metal album, but it definitely has a lot of that element going on. There are no longer any psychedelic moments going on here. This is pure on prog metal almost. It's just my opinion. Again, released in 1977. I'm going to take out the booklet here a little bit, talk about it. Could talk about this album for a whole show as well. And you've got like this, they've got this floating pig flying around the thing. But it's supposed to be about George Orwell's Animal Farm, right? About communism and how it can take over and stuff. It's probably a very relevant book for today's world, a very relevant album for today's world. So they filmed this, and this is probably my favorite track on the album, Dogs. I think for most people who like this album, it usually is their favorite track. It's very heavy. Nice shot of the Suburban, of the factory. I don't know, is this factory still around? Probably. So synonymous with Pink Floyd now. Maybe they've turned it into a museum. Who knows? Yeah, so this is excellent. I did get this copy, which I like quite a bit. Another shot of it from the water area. So I think what they did is they took the building itself and moved it into their own landscape here for this album cover. I've been listening to this now since about 2006. It's probably been my favorite Floyd album almost since the same year, and has remained my favorite Floyd album, although I would have to say that Dark Side of the Moon, because I've had a lot more time to listen to it now, is definitely a challenger, but I still think this is their best album. Yeah, just based on the heaviness, not as much that noisy, how you say, soundscape that they use a lot of, like all kinds of different noises. Not as much of that on here, but the album itself is heavy. So yeah, if you haven't heard this album, you got to give it a try. If you're getting into Pink Floyd, this will bring bring you full in. Thanks, Wade, for your comment. I appreciate it. So we're going to go on to the next album. So that was their 10th studio album. And for me, up to this point, it's been a constant build, like just a up and down, but now they're just soaring, like they're completely at the top. I think this really cemented them as one of the great rock bands. But the next album, of course, Pink Floyd's The Wall. This really put them into a stratosphere unparalleled by very few bands. Don't get into this kind of thing. So many feel that this is their fourth great studio album. A lot of people think this is their best album. This is a double album, the second one they've done. This is also their 11th studio album. Coming out in 1980, I think, or 79. Was it 79 or 80? I think it was 80. I always forget either this or Breakfast in America. I think Breakfast in America came out in 79, this one in 1980. So it is a double album, a concept album, entire album put together by Roger Waters. This is kind of the end of the band in many ways. Doesn't say what year it was, but I'm pretty sure. No, it was 79, so I had it backwards. 1979. Double album concept with a absolutely dominating stage show for this album. To me, in many ways, this may be considered the first Pink Floyd, or the first Roger Waters solo album. I've heard that before. He gave him a choice of this or the pros and cons of hitchhiking, and they chose this to do. Maybe if they'd done the pros and cons of hitchhiking, it might be a different album. I don't care for Roger Waters solo stuff. I've never really liked it. And this doesn't feel like a Roger Waters solo album. It does have some of the elements of his solo stuff. There's no doubt about it. But it feels like a Pink Floyd album to me, even though it's all entirely written by him. There was a lot of problems with members of the band. In fact, they kicked Richard Wright right out of the band at this point. Nick Mason wasn't contributing hardly anything. It was Roger Waters power playing here. And there was a lot of friction between the other members and him. Now, is he a brilliant writer? Obviously, you can't write something like this and not be brilliant. This is one of the most well-received albums in history. Like, it's just sold so many copies. It's not one of my personal favorites. In fact, this album probably kept Pink Floyd out of the bands that I liked for the longest time. I just didn't get into this. I didn't like it. There are some really good stuff on here. There's like about a half a dozen tracks that I think are excellent. I just think the album is too long. If they'd made it a single album, I know he couldn't do this, but maybe they'd made it 3 album sides, might have been okay. There are some filler on here, in my opinion. But I don't think you can tell the story and remove any of the parts, because it's a Roger Waters, what do they call these, concept album about parts of his childhood and stuff. So, or in this case, the character Pink. So yeah, it's grown on me. Let's put it this way. I like it a lot more now, maybe because I'm older and I can appreciate the effort that went into making this, and the purpose of it and the concept of it and everything. It's just not one of my favorite Pink Floyd albums, but there's no denying its greatness. I don't think you could. Anybody who would say this is a stinker is just missing the point. I don't think it's a stinker. It's just not something I go to. I don't feel connected to it in a lot of ways. And it was a downward trend, but at the time, for me, this was the first Pink Floyd album I ever heard, so I dismissed the band as something I wouldn't be interested in because I simply didn't like the album at the time, which is unfortunate. It took me 20 years and a yard sale to change my opinion about Pink Floyd. I went to the yard sale. Some people have heard me say this before. There was a copy of The Dark Side of the Moon there for $1, and I bought it saying, yeah, it's worth $1 at least, right? So I figured it's just going to be like this. I took it home and I didn't actually play it for a while, but then when I started playing, I thought, wow, this is so much better and so much different than this. And that's what launched Pink Floyd for me. After that, I got Animals maybe a few years after that, and then Pink Floyd just rose up the ladder for me. So there you go. That's The Wall. That I believe that's their, I think it's their 11th studio album. Then for me, and for many people, that was the end of Pink Floyd. They did do this album a few years later, like I think it was like 5 years later, maybe, or 3 years later. 83, I believe. Yeah, so 3 or 4 years later. This is not a really good copy of it. It's got all the song lists here. You see, I'm not sure what that flowery thing is supposed to be. So this is kind of, I think many people feel this is kind of just leftover stuff from The Wall. So to me, this is kind of weak. There's not a lot of stuff on here that really appeals to me or is memorable. So at this point in time, Roger Waters left the band after he tried to shut it down, and they lost that in court. So they didn't shut it down. They continued on without him. He left the band at this point. The final cut, primarily written by him, because most of this stuff was written during the Wall time. It's just kind of like stuff that Jethro Tull does when they throw extra stuff on their albums. That's just stuff that was written and produced at the same time and didn't make the cut of the album. This is kind of the same thing here. But it's not terrible, but it's not great either. I would put this down there with Amagama as maybe just trash, So like I said, Pink Floyd is one of those bands that's had like some super, super strong albums, some stuff in the middle, but some really terrible albums at the bottom. And then maybe this next album would have fallen in that same category, but I've warmed up to it over the years. This is a Momentary Lapse of Reason. I think this was an 85 release. Just going to check to see if they give you that here. Sometimes they do and sometimes they don't, as you know. I believe it was an 85 release. This is, of course, a remake, so it's not so much of it's like really polarized and different from maybe the original copy. But, I do like the aspect of this I like is that it has that Pink Floyd sound to it. Now, the lyrics aren't nearly as good. I think they're very different. You can see the difference. Cover is very Pink Floydish, though, for sure. And of course, you've got the guitar. This was produced by Bob Ezrin and David Gilmour. So this is maybe some people. Oh, this was originally 87. Sorry, I thought it was 85, but it's 87 September. So it's kind of more dominated. Of course, it's dominated by David Gilmour. So some might say it's a David Gilmour solo album. Again, I'm going to say something. So with The Wall, people said that was a Roger Waters solo album, but I've listened to Roger Waters solo albums. I don't like them. I do like The Wall. Same thing here. I like this album, but I don't like David Gilmour's solo stuff either. So yeah, to me, they're both Floyd. This actually probably sounds more Floyd-ish than the final cut, I think. I think this is just has that more of that feeling of a Pink Floyd album. So I kind of like it for that reason. So we're going to get to, this is much later, 1994, I believe. Maybe. We're talking, of course, about this album, which is Division Bell. This is the second album to come out after Roger Waters had left the band. Pretty much dominated again by David Gilmour. I think he had some people writing for him, his wife being one of them, I believe. But you have back in the band for this, although not a full member of the band, Richard Wright is by this time, was he reinstated as a member of the band? Because I know on Relapse, he was just considered a guest, but I think he might have been reinstated at this point. And he wrote quite a bit of stuff on here too, so at least the musical parts. Yeah, this is another one. I like this album. I like both the post, or at least two of the post albums by Pink Floyd, the post Roger Waters albums. This one I do like, and Relapse, I do like both of them. This one I like more than Relapse, though. So, although Relapse is waiting its turn in my playlist, so maybe that will change. I do like this kind of opposing faces here. Obviously, there's a bit of a conflict going on there, and it's not hard to figure out who that conflict's between. But I'm not going to state it here. I'll leave that up to people to decide if that's actually what's going on here. But some really good stuff on this album. Again, lyrically, not really Floydish, but musically, it does have that Floyd sound to it, and that's the reason why I like it as well, I think. So that's it for the main part of the discography. Now they did have another album that came out, but it was more than 20 years after, like in 2014. I think it was like 10 years ago. The Endless River. I don't own it. I've never heard it, so I'm not going to make any comments about it. But other than to say enough people have commented that it's really the worst Pink Floyd album. It's a collection of not so good stuff that they took from other eras and put together. It's kind of, I think the purpose of the album was to kind of I like a tribute to Richard Wright, because he had passed away by this time, although it took 6 years for this to come out. I think it's not the greatest tribute to a member of your band. I get the idea that you wanted to do something for them, and I appreciate their efforts to do that. I just don't think the material is all that great. And not enough for me to buy it. I think I actually did hear it once. Somebody had given it to me to listen to, not the album itself, but had suggested I should just go and listen to it online. I think I did, but completely unmemorable to me, so I didn't follow it after that. I mean, of course, if I see it somewhere and it's not too expensive, I'll probably get it just so I can complete the collection. I did want to talk a little bit about this one live album as well. So this is the Nebworth, Live at the Nebworth, Pink Floyd. So this features the three main guys at this point in time: Richard Wright, Nick Mason, and David Gilmour. There's no appearance here by Roger Waters at all. They did cover some pretty good stuff here. There's a nice picture of the three of them there. And I believe they had a bass player that came in and supported them, but I'm not 100% sure. I'm sure they did. They probably had a ton of musicians on here. Yeah, there's lots of musicians on here. So you got David Gilmour on guitar and vocals, Nick Mason on drums and percussion, Richard Wright on keyboards and backing vocals. You had Guy Pratt on bass and vocals, John Caron on keyboards and vocals, Tim Renwick on guitars, Gary Wallace on percussion, Durga McBroom on backing vocals, Sam Brown, Vicki Brown, and Claire Torrey all on backing vocals as well. And then Claire, I believe, did the lead vocals on The Great Gig in the Sky. Now, was she the original that did that? Can anybody tell me? I could go back and look through the Dark Side of the Moon, but I think I remember her being the original voice on that, doing the Great Gig in the Sky operatic voice. Yeah, you've got some keyboards on Comfortably Numb and Run Like Hell from Michael Craron, Candy Dulfer on sax on Shine On You Crazy Diamond, and Money. And this album was produced by Chris Kimsey and Steve Smith. So, yeah, this is a well put together live album. I mean, it's missing Roger Waters, which is a shame, because as much as I don't really like the guy too much and have problems with some of the stuff he's done, and as good as this is, I think it would have been better with him on it. He just is a stage presence. He has a good voice too, and he wrote most of this stuff. So, yeah, just pretty excellent. Just all there is shots of I'm just looking for decent ones to show you. Shots of the covers of the songs that they're doing here. Now, does it tell you what? I'm sure it gives you a track list here. does give you this little kind of a psychedelic feel to it at points in time. So yeah, there are 7 tracks on this live album. It's a single disc one, recorded at Nebworth House in Nebworth, Hertfordshire in the UK in 1990. So it's only 35 years ago already. And also performed at the Brit School for Performing Arts and Technology. And I guess it was an aid album for Nordiff Robbins Music Center, which is at the Brit School of Performing Arts and Technology. That makes sense then. So there are like 7 tracks on here. None of these songs, if you're a Floyd fan, there's nothing here that you wouldn't know. Shine on Your Crazy Diamond, parts 1 through 5. The Great Gig in the Sky, that's the operatic song from Dark Side of the Moon, of course. Wish You Were Here, the title track off of that album. Sorrow, Money, of course, another great, probably I think it's probably one of their best, if not their best known single, maybe, probably their best known single. Comfortably Numb, of course, which is a fantastic song off the wall. And then Run Like Hell, which is also off the wall. So they have 3 walls on here and a couple of songs from Dark Side of the Moon. Yeah, so an excellent live album. I do like this a lot. Sometimes I like that live feel that Pink Floyd has, and I'm going to sneeze here. Sorry. Excuse me. Just got something in my nose there for a second. Yeah, so that's all of the Pink Floyd albums that I'm going to talk about today. There are a large number of tribute albums to them. I have one, but I'm not going to go there with it. I mean, the reason I bought it is because Paul Stanley and Gene Simmons were on it, doing vocals on a couple of tracks. There's quite a few people on there, but it doesn't give you a list who's on there. So you just have to listen to it and figure out who it is that's singing. I think they're one of those bands that they're a bit of what I would call them a bit of a polarizing band. So there are people who absolutely love Pink Floyd, and there's people who absolutely hate them. It's kind of the same with Rush too. Maybe more so with Rush than with Pink Floyd. There aren't as many people that hate Pink Floyd, but Pink Floyd, as great as they are, have had some real turkeys as well in their discography. And that's not unusual. Every band has at least one turkey. There's very few. Maybe Supertramp might be the only one that comes to mind that really doesn't have any turkeys in their discography. Everything's great. But usually it starts at the beginning before they're really up and running fully. In the case of Pink Floyd, it took them a while to get to the Dark Side of the Moon. Usually most bands, I think, have their magnus opus album in around the 3rd or 4th album. Usually that's the case. Sometimes you get them who have a debut albums like that, or maybe their 2nd album, but very few get to the 8th album before they really have that magnus opus. And Pink Floyd was the one band that I know has done that. So that's it for the discography. Now, is there anybody who has any questions out there that may want to ask them? They can do that. The other thing about Pink Floyd, it seems like just yesterday to me that they were a world dominant band. And now there's, for me, back in that day, people would ask me who were the greatest bands in the world. And even though I was a huge Rush fan, I knew at that time period that it was Zeppelin and Floyd. They were the 2 master bands for that period of time that I was growing up. Everybody pretty much said one or the other. I mean, you get the odd person who would throw the Beatles in there too. And I know that's going to be a bit controversial for nowadays, but things have changed. It's been 40 years, 45 years since Pink Floyd really was front and center in the music world, kind of the same time period as those 2 big bands, Floyd and Zeppelin, kind of left at the same time, like almost within a year of each other. They were kind of gone. Yeah, Pink Floyd did put out some more albums and stuff, but for the most part, their build to the pinnacle that they made with The Wall kind of ended after The Wall, and it was kind of a little bit of a slide after that. And it's been over 40 years really since they've done anything substantial, and even longer for Led Zeppelin. So So memories have faded. People don't see those two bands the way they used to. I get that now. It was kind of a shock to me when people thought that. To me, it was clear that Led Zeppelin was the best band in the world, and it was kind of a shock to me when people challenged me on that and said, "No, it's the Beatles." I still think the Led Zeppelin is, but I see now that there's a lot of people don't even know who some of these bands are anymore. I don't think it's come to the point where nobody knows who Pink Floyd is, but it's definitely not. They haven't been front and center for a very long time. There's a lot of other bands that have come in that time period that many people consider to be better. There was a period of time in the 90s where I was hearing that the greatest rock band in history was U2, and I didn't throw up or anything, but I was very annoyed by that. Even the thought of saying that over some of these other bands is kind of annoying. But I have my opinions because I grew up listening to most of the bands that people consider to be iconic, and so I was there when they were at their best. So I just have a biased opinion, I guess. And for a lot of people, there may be some bands that they grew up with. A lot of these people that watch this kind of stuff grew up in the 90s, so they're going to have a totally different view of who are the greatest bands of all time because they didn't listen to these. But it's just your own environment and how you've come there. Is that really being the greatest of all time? And that really is just very subjective. It all depends on your point of view. I mean, if you're just going by straight numbers, the greatest rock musician in history is maybe Michael Jackson, right? Because he stole more albums than anybody else. So if you're just going straight by numbers, that would be the case. Him and the Beatles would be number one. Maybe Madonna's up there too, but I don't think it's just about albums. I think that there's a certain quality of what's going on that makes that different. Otherwise, Led Zeppelin wouldn't even be there. I mean, yeah, they've had some great selling albums, and did some amazing things, but there's people that will point to the Beatles having sold way more albums, so therefore are a much better band. But I don't think it's all about record sales. I really don't. I think it's about how impactful the band was on the audience they were playing to. And as great as I think Led Zeppelin is, I don't necessarily think they were that great live. I actually didn't enjoy anything by them live really at all. I do love their studio albums. They're probably one of the great bands for studio albums. Pink Floyd I never seen, so I can't really make a comment. I have seen them live on YouTube and stuff. It's a bit different, but I think there are some bands out there that are absolutely killer live, maybe not as good studio wise, and then there's the opposite as well. So, but Pink Floyd definitely has to be amongst the greatest rock bands of all time. And I wouldn't have said that 20 years or even 15 years ago because I wasn't a huge follower of them. It's just been more recently in the last 20 years that I've started to really get into them. But nevertheless, I might not even call them rock at some point, but clearly they are. So anyways, I hope that you've enjoyed this episode of Into the Progverse. We'll be doing this stream again. I think it's going to be not so much of a time lapse between it. I'm going to try and do it regularly. I don't know if that'll happen next week. I have to consider that. Sorry, I got something in my eye here from sitting here for so long. I think it's the screen. It makes my eye itchy. Anyways, so we're going to do this stream very, very long. Very regularly. So I'm looking at maybe doing another one in a couple weeks and then gradually build it up. So I'm doing it weekly. I'm still not sure if this time slot is the best. So I'll try some different slots until I find one that kind of suits people. So anyways, thanks for showing up. I appreciate it all. And we will be back in maybe a couple weeks doing another live stream. I got to figure out which band I want to do next. I kind of know who that's going to be. So hopefully you'll show up for that, and we'll see you then. Take care and have a good one. Goodbye.